In the golden age of Greek heroes, when gods still walked among mortals, and the boundary between the possible and impossible was little more than a suggestion, there lived a young man whose voice could make the very stones weep with longing. His name was Orpheus, and he was no ordinary mortal, though neither was he entirely divine. His father was Apollo himself, the radiant god of music, poetry, and light, who had gifted his son a golden lyre and taught him to coax from it melodies that transcended the merely beautiful. His mother was Calliope, the most distinguished of the 9 muses, she who presided over epic poetry and eloquence. With such parentage, perhaps it was inevitable that Orpheus would become the greatest musician the world had ever known. But what made Orpheus extraordinary wasn't simply his divine heritage, it was what he did with his gift. When Orpheus played his lyre and sang, rivers would pause in their courses to listen. Trees would uproot themselves and shuffle closer, their branches swaying in time to his melodies. Wild beasts, savage lions, territorial bears, even the most vicious of wolves, would lie down peacefully at his feet, their predatory natures temporarily forgotten in the presence of such beauty. Rocks would soften, storms would calm, and even the most hardened hearts would find themselves moved to tears. He travelled throughout Thrace and beyond, his reputation preceding him like the first rays of dawn. Hardened warriors would weep openly at his concerts. Jealous rivals would lay down their grudges. The elderly would remember their youth, and young lovers would find words for feelings they had never been able to express. His music didn't simply entertain. It transformed, healed, and illuminated the deepest recesses of the human soul. Yet for all his extraordinary gifts, Orpheus remained humble. He didn't perform for glory or gold, though both were offered to him in abundance. He sang because music was as essential to him as breathing, because in those melodies he found a language more truthful than any words could ever be. And perhaps deep in his heart, he sensed that his greatest song was yet to be sung, though he could never have imagined the terrible price it would demand. It was at a festival celebrating the spring harvest that Orpheus first saw Eurydice, and in that moment his entire understanding of music changed. She was a wood nymph, a dryad, who moved with the unconscious grace of wind through leaves, her laughter like water over stones. She had come from the forests with her sister nymphs to join the celebration, and when Orpheus saw her dancing in a circle of flowers, he felt his heart stop and restart with a new rhythm. For perhaps the first time in his life, the great musician found himself at a loss for words. He who could charm serpents and move mountains stood frozen, his lyre hanging uselessly at his side. It was Eurydice who approached him, curious about the young man who looked at her with such unguarded wonder. "You're the famous Orpheus," she said, smiling. "I've heard the animals in my forest singing your melodies." He managed to stammer something in response, and she laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine delight at seeing the legendary musician so endearingly flustered. She asked him to play for her, and he did, pouring into his music all the sudden emotions that had erupted in his chest. But this time, he wasn't performing for an audience or demonstrating his skill. He was speaking directly to her soul, and she heard him. Their courtship was a thing of legend. Orpheus would visit the forest groves where Eurydice lived, and together they would walk beneath the ancient trees. He would play for her songs that he composed in the quiet hours of the night, each one a new facet of his love. She would show him the secret places of the forest, teach him the names of flowers that bloomed only in moonlight, introduce him to the shy woodland creatures who called her friend. They were opposites in many ways. He was the celebrated artist, known throughout the Greek world, while she was a creature of the shadows and the green places, uncomfortable in cities and crowds. He lived in words and melodies, while she existed in the unspoken language of growing things. Yet these differences made them complete each other more perfectly. She grounded him, reminded him of the simple joys he had sometimes overlooked in his pursuit of the perfect song. He opened her world, showing her how music could capture and express the very beauty she embodied. When Orpheus asked Eurydice to be his wife, she didn't hesitate. The wedding was held in a forest clearing, attended by nymphs and mortals alike, with Apollo himself blessing the union. It should have been the happiest day of their lives, and in many ways it was. Yet some who were there later remembered that the torches carried in the wedding procession smoked and sputtered, refusing to burn with a clear flame. And the god Hymen, who presided over marriages, seemed troubled, though he said nothing of his concerns. But on that day, in that moment, Orpheus and Eurydice were radiantly happy, certain that their love would endure forever. How could they have known that forever would be measured not in years, but in a handful of brief, precious weeks? The serpent had been sleeping in the tall grass beside the stream, coiled and camouflaged, when Eurydice came running through the meadow. She was laughing, breathless, fleeing in a game from her sister nymphs. She didn't see it. How could she? The snake was perfectly still, merely defending its small territory in the only way it knew how. Her foot came down directly on its scaled back. The viper struck with pure instinct, its fangs sinking into her ankle. Eurydice stumbled and fell, her laughter cutting off into a gasp of pain and shock. Her companions found her within moments, but it was already too late. The venom was fast and merciless. A snake sacred to the gods, some said later, though whether that made the tragedy more meaningful or more cruel, none could say. Eurydice looked up at her friends gathered around her, felt the numbness spreading up her leg, and thought of Orpheus. She tried to speak his name, but her tongue had grown heavy. The world was fading, the bright summer day dimming as though dusk were falling. But it wasn't dusk. It was something else, something final and irrevocable. She died there in the meadow, surrounded by flowers, with the afternoon sun warm on her face and her husband's name unspoken on her lips. When they brought the news to Orpheus, he didn't believe them. How could he? They had been married such a short time. She had been so vibrantly alive that very morning, kissing him goodbye as he left to perform at a nearby town. This had to be some cruel joke, some terrible mistake. But then they brought her body, and he saw the truth in her pale, still face. The sound that came from Orpheus then was barely human, a wail of such pure anguish that those who heard it would never forget it. It was as if all the beauty he had ever created with his music had been inverted, transformed into an expression of absolute despair. He fell to his knees beside her body and gathered her into his arms, rocking back and forth, calling her name again and again, as if he could summon her back through sheer force of will. For 7 days and 7 nights, Orpheus sat with Eurydice's body, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing to let anyone take her from him. He played his lyre constantly, singing songs of such profound grief that the entire countryside seemed to mourn with him. Trees shed their leaves out of season. Rivers swelled with what might have been tears. Even the stones seemed to slump in sorrow. Finally, on the 8th day, they had to take her body for burial. Orpheus watched as they laid his wife in the earth, covering her with soil until she was gone from sight. And as the funeral rites concluded, and the mourners began to drift away, a terrible resolve settled over him. He would not accept this. He could not accept this. Death might claim ordinary lovers, but he was Orpheus, whose music could move the unmovable. If his songs could make rivers change their courses and mountains bow their heads, surely they could move even the gods of death themselves. He would go to the Underworld, He would find Eurydice's shade, and he would bring her back, or die trying. The entrance to the underworld was in Tainarum, at the southern tip of Greece, where a cave mouth yawned like the maw of some ancient beast. Most men avoided this place, understanding instinctively that the boundary between life and death was not meant to be crossed by the living. But Orpheus walked toward it, with his lyre in his hands and an impossible hope in his heart. The descent was long and treacherous. The path led down through tunnels that grew progressively darker and colder, where the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of death. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows, whispers in languages Orpheus didn't recognize, the distant sound of weeping, sometimes what might have been laughter, though it was utterly devoid of joy. He passed the white-barked poplar groves sacred to Persephone, where the leaves rustled though there was no wind. He crossed the river Styx, where the ancient ferryman Charon initially refused him passage. The living were not his cargo. But when Orpheus played a melody of such longing that even the cold waters of the Styx seemed to warm, Charon relented, though he shook his head as if Orpheus were already a ghost. On the far shore he faced Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of the dead. Each head was as large as a horse, with teeth like daggers and eyes that burned with an unholy fire. The beast had torn apart countless shades who tried to escape, and it moved toward Orpheus with clear, hostile intent, all three mouths slavering. Orpheus stood his ground and played. The music that poured from his lyre was a masterpiece, a song of devotion so pure and powerful that even this monster, bred and raised in the depths of Hades, was moved. One by one, each massive head lowered, and soon the fearsome guardian lay on the ground like a puppy, all three heads resting peacefully, allowing this unprecedented living visitor to pass. Beyond Cerberus lay the realm of Hades itself. It was a vast, grey wasteland where the shades of the dead drifted like fog, barely conscious, barely remembering who they had been in life. They moved without purpose, spoke without meaning, existing in a state that was neither life nor peaceful rest. Some noticed Orpheus as he passed, a living man, still warm with breath and blood, and reached toward him with translucent hands, perhaps hoping he could carry them back to the world above. But Orpheus had eyes only for his destination, the black palace of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. The building rose from the grey plain like a wound in reality itself, constructed of obsidian and darkness, imposing and terrible in its cold majesty. 2 thrones sat at the far end of the throne room, and upon them sat the rulers of the dead. Hades, grim and implacable, his face showing no more emotion than stone. And beside him, Persephone, the stolen bride who spent half her life in sunlight and half in shadow, her expression unreadable as she watched this living man approach with his golden lyre. Orpheus fell to his knees before them and began to play the most important performance of his life. What Orpheus played in that throne room has never been replicated, for it came not from technical skill, but from the deepest wellspring of human emotion. It was a song of love, not the romantic ideal celebrated by poets, but love in its truest, most vulnerable form. It was a melody about meeting someone who completes you, about building a life together out of shared moments and whispered promises. It was about morning light on her hair and the way she laughed at his terrible jokes and the comfortable silence they shared in the evening. And then the song shifted, becoming a dirge of loss. He sang of the empty space in his bed, the conversations he began before remembering she wasn't there to hear them, the way food had lost its taste and colour had drained from the world. He sang of grief so profound it felt like drowning, of a future stretched before him like a desert with no oasis in sight. Throughout the vast palace, the dead stopped their aimless wandering to listen. Shades who hadn't felt anything in centuries found themselves weeping, or trying to weep, for they had no tears to shed. The ancient judge Tantalus, condemned to eternal hunger and thirst, forgot his suffering for a moment, lost in the beauty of the music. Ixion's burning wheel stopped turning. Even the tormented Sisyphus paused in his eternal task, his boulder forgotten, as he listened to a man singing about a love that transcended death itself. Orpheus sang of injustice, that Eurydice, so young and full of life, had been taken by a meaningless accident. She wasn't a hero who had died in glory, nor an old woman who had lived a full life. She was a bride, stolen by fate in the first bloom of their happiness. He sang not with anger, but with desperate pleading, asking not for justice, but for mercy, not for what he deserved, but for what he could not live without. And then, most cunningly, most brilliantly, he turned his song toward Persephone herself. He sang of stolen brides, of women torn from the sunlight and dragged into darkness. He sang of the pain of separation, of learning to love in the land of the dead, of the eternal longing for the world above. Every word was carefully chosen, every note precisely placed to remind the queen of the underworld of her own story. When the song ended, the silence was absolute. Persephone was weeping. Tears, actual tears, ran down her immortal face, the first she had shed in centuries. Even Hades, the inflexible lord of death, seemed moved, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. Throughout the realm, the dead stood frozen, hoping against hope that the impossible might happen. Hades and Persephone looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way that long-married couples develop. Finally, Hades spoke, his voice like grinding stone. Orpheus, son of Apollo, your music has accomplished what no mortal has ever achieved. You have moved the hearts of death itself. We will grant your request. Eurydice shall follow you back to the world of the living. Orpheus felt his heart soar, relief and joy flooding through him so intensely he thought he might collapse. But Hades raised one hand, and the joy froze in Orpheus's chest. However, the god continued, and that single word carried the weight of doom. There is a condition. Eurydice will walk behind you as you return to the surface. You must not look back at her, not once, not for any reason, until you both have reached the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her before then, she will be lost to you forever, and you will never be permitted to return. It was a cruel condition, seemingly arbitrary, but the gods of death did not give their gifts freely, and Hades was not known for his mercy. Perhaps it was a test of faith, or perhaps it was meant to remind Orpheus that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be recrossed without cost, or perhaps the god of death simply wanted to ensure that this disruption of the natural order would haunt Orpheus for whatever time remained to him. Orpheus nodded his agreement, not trusting himself to speak. What choice did he have? He would have agreed to any terms, no matter how difficult. As long as Eurydice could return, he would endure anything. Persephone gestured, and from the crowd of shades, one stepped forward. It was Eurydice, though so pale and translucent now, barely more solid than mist. But her eyes still held recognition and love when they found Orpheus. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "Go!" Hades commanded. "And remember, do not look back." The return journey began in hope. Orpheus walked slowly, carefully, his every step measured and deliberate. Behind him, he could hear the whisper-soft footfalls of Eurydice's shade. Barely audible, barely there, but there. His heart sang with each sound, proof that she was following, that the impossible was happening. that love had indeed conquered death. The path seemed longer on the return than it had on the descent, each turn stretching into eternity. The darkness pressed close, and strange voices called from the shadows, perhaps trying to distract him, perhaps jealous of his success. But Orpheus kept his eyes fixed forward, gripping his lyre so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted desperately to turn, to reassure himself that she was still there. The sounds of her footsteps were so faint. What if she had fallen behind? What if the gods had tricked him, and there was nothing behind him but empty air? The doubt grew with each step, a poisonous whisper in his mind. But he pressed on. He passed back across the Styx where Charon watched with ancient, knowing eyes. He walked through the poplar groves, their white bark glowing faintly in the underground gloom. The path began to slope upward, and Orpheus felt his hope growing. They were ascending. They were leaving the realm of death. They were going to make it. And then, in the distance, he saw it. Light. Not the cold, ghostly luminescence of the underworld, but genuine sunlight, warm and golden, spilling down from the mouth of the cave like liquid life. The exit was close, so close. Just a few more steps, and they would be free. Eurydice would be restored to full life by the touch of the sun, and their nightmare would be over. Orpheus's pace quickened, his heart pounding with anticipation. The sunlight grew brighter, warmer. He could feel it on his face, smell the scent of the living world. Grass and flowers and clean air. He was steps away now, moments from breaking the condition and being able to turn and embrace his wife. But then a terrible doubt seized him. What if she hadn't made it this far? What if somewhere in the darkness behind him, her shade had faltered or faded? What if he emerged into the sunlight alone, his triumph empty, his wife still trapped in the realm of the dead? The footsteps behind him, had they stopped? He couldn't hear them anymore over the sound of his own movement and the rushing of his blood in his ears. He was standing in the sunlight now, the warm rays washing over him like a benediction. He had made it. He was in the world of the living. Surely it was safe now to look, to confirm that Eurydice had made it out as well. Later, people would debate what happened in that moment. Some said he forgot the condition in his joy and relief. Others claimed the gods had purposely made the terms ambiguous. Was the sunlight enough? Or did Eurydice also need to reach it first? Still others believed Orpheus knew exactly what he was doing, that the uncertainty had become unbearable, that he chose to know rather than to hope. But whatever the reason, in that moment, standing in the sunlight with the cave mouth just behind him, Orpheus turned to look at Eurydice. She was there, just emerging from the shadows, not yet quite in the light. For one brief, eternal moment, their eyes met. He saw love and joy and relief in her face, and then he saw understanding. She knew what he had done. She knew what was about to happen. "Farewell," she whispered, the word barely audible, and then the shadows wrapped around her like grasping hands. She was being pulled backward, drawn down into the darkness. Orpheus lunged forward, trying to grab her, to hold on, but his hands passed through her insubstantial form like smoke. "Orpheus!" she called out, her voice growing fainter as the distance between them increased. "Don't grieve. I love you. I've always loved you. Don't..." And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness, returned to the realm of the dead forever. This time, there would be no second chance, no appeal, no reprieve. The condition had been broken, and the judgment was final. Orpheus stood frozen at the cave mouth, one hand still reaching toward the darkness, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. He had been so close. She had been right there, just a single step away from life, and he had ruined it. his impatience, his doubt, his need to know. It had destroyed everything. He tried to return to the underworld, rushing back down into the darkness, calling Eurydice's name, but the way was now barred. Charon refused him passage. The path simply wouldn't take him where he needed to go. He wandered the tunnels for days, growing weaker and more desperate. But the realm of the dead was closed to him now. The living were not meant to visit that place even once, and he had exhausted his welcome. Orpheus emerged from the cave into a world that seemed to have lost all meaning. He wandered back to Thrace, to the forests where he and Eurydice had walked together, and there he remained, refusing all comfort, rejecting all company except the trees and the animals that had always been drawn to his music. He still played his lyre, but the music was different now. Gone were the joyful melodies that had once made rocks dance and rivers change course. Now he played songs of loss and regret, of love that endured beyond death and mistakes that could never be undone. They were achingly beautiful, those songs, but they were also unbearably sad. Those who heard them from a distance would find themselves weeping without understanding why. He spurned the company of women, having no heart for anyone but his lost love. This angered some, particularly the Maenads, the wild female followers of Dionysus, who saw his rejection as an insult to their god and to womanhood itself. They came upon him one night as he sat playing in a forest clearing, and in their frenzy they tore him apart. Even as they struck him, even as his blood soaked into the earth, Orpheus continued to play, his fingers never leaving the strings of his lyre. The trees that had always loved his music tried to shield him with their branches, and the stones themselves rose up to defend him, but the Maenads' frenzy could not be stopped. They threw his severed head and his lyre into the river Hebrus, where they floated downstream, the head still singing, the lyre still playing, creating a haunting harmony that echoed through the valley. The Muses found him there, and buried his body with all the honor due to the greatest musician who had ever lived. His lyre was placed among the stars by Zeus himself, forming the constellation Lyra, so that Orpheus's music would continue forever in the wheeling of the heavens. But as for Orpheus's shade, when it descended to the underworld for the final time, it went eagerly, for it knew who waited there. Eurydice was watching for him, standing at the edge of the asphodel meadows, and when she saw him coming, she smiled and held out her hand. This time, when they walked together through the realm of the dead, there was no condition, no test, no looking back, only the eternity they had been promised, but denied. They are there still, some say, wandering the grey fields, hand in hand, finally together, their love having outlasted life itself. And if you listen very carefully on quiet nights, when the stars are bright and the constellation Lyra rises in the sky, you might hear the faint echo of his music, still singing of love and loss, and the impossible distances we would cross for those we cannot bear to lose. The end, and yet not the end, for true songs never really die. They simply wait to be heard again. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss new videos.